in response to my previous videos in which I asked the question, is atheism rational and scientific? And there was another video where I compared the atheistic worldview and the Christian worldview and what answers they offer to the questions about the origin, meaning, purpose, and destiny of life. And in response to those videos, I received some feedback, criticism, and objections, mostly from atheists. And some people have put up really detailed arguments as to why, what alternative explanations they could give to the points I made, or why they reject Christianity. In particular, I've received some feedback from a person who sent me some links in which some atheists are supposedly debunking the resurrection story presented in the Gospels. Now, I can't address all the objections in this one video because that would make this video a super lengthy one. But what I plan to do is to make a series of videos answering all the reasonable objections that are raised. Now, in this video, I'll cover the objection that potentially Gospels are probably legends, especially when it comes to the issue of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That probably is a legend. Now, when people say this, the argument they use is that there are differences in the Gospels, in the four Gospels, and they see, at least they say, that we can see a sequence of extra additions to the Gospel, embellishments, especially when it comes to the story of the resurrection of Christ. They say the first Gospel, Mark, is very short, did not have a lot of details about the resurrection. And then came Matthew. He added more details, embellished a little bit, to make it more supernaturally. And then Luke came along, adding even more details. And then John came, he added further more details. So what they say is this is a proof or an argument that there have been additions and embellishments, and therefore this story is not really genuine. It's a legend. It's a story that people made up, and that's why there is no consistency. There are a couple of problems with this argument. First one is that the people who put up this argument, they are falsely assuming that the Gospel of Mark was written before the Gospel of Matthew. Evidence shows us that that's not true. The evidence from ancient and early church tells us that the Gospel of Matthew was written before the Gospel of Mark. Now, early church has been pretty much unanimous on this. I'll read you a quote from one of the early church fathers, Origen. He says, as I have learned by tradition concerning the four Gospels, which alone are received without dispute by the Church of God under heaven, the first was written by Saint Matthew, once a tax gatherer, afterwards an apostle of Jesus Christ, who published it for the benefit of the Jewish converts, composed in the Hebrew language. So here we have one of the early church fathers saying that he has received it by tradition from the church fathers who are even before him, saying that Saint Matthew wrote the first of the four Gospels. So the scholars who try to date Mark before Matthew has to ask themselves, why are we trying so desperately to date it before the Gospel of Matthew, contrary to the evidence that we have? Is it because if we date Matthew before Mark, as the evidence shows us, is it because that doesn't fit with the narrative? I'd leave it up to the viewers to think of that. But there's some more to say on this issue. So first of all, the argument that there are embellishments is based on the idea that Mark was written first, which is wrong. As I just said, Matthew was written first, and the evidence shows us that. Now, then the next question they would say, or the next reason why they think this is not a real story, or that there were embellishments, is because they say, well, clearly, not all the Gospels are saying the same thing. They have different details, and it looks like some people embellished it. the problem is with assuming, this is the second reason why, for that argument, is that they assume that the only reason why, when multiple accounts of an incident are presented, the only reason why there would be differences between them, and the only reason why we see some accounts having more detail, is because someone embellished them. Now, that is a faulty assumption. There could be many reasons why there are differences in the accounts told by different people about the same issue. Simple things like memory, or the purpose for which they are writing the account of that incident. Now, we believe that gospel writers had supernaturally activated memories with which they wrote about the incidents that took place. Now, but why do they have differences? Why do they have those? Why each gospel writer presented some details and not the others? That has to do with their purpose. I don't know if many people are aware of this, but each gospel writer had a different purpose, and God providentially used all of them to present the gospel message to everyone. If you take the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew wrote that gospel for Jewish audience. And because he's writing to Jews who were anticipating a Messiah, a promised king who would come and deliver them from Romans and other pagan nations, when Matthew wrote that gospel to the Jewish audience, he presented Jesus Christ as the promised king. That's his emphasis. So he included a lot of details about what Jesus did and said, because people would be interested to hear about what their king has to say. Mark, on the other hand, wrote his gospel for the Romans. And if you know anything about the Roman society during the time of Jesus, or during the time of his contemporaries, most of the population, well, maybe not most, but at least half of the population, roughly, were slaves, servants, and bond servants, different types of servants. They had a well-established system of slavery back then. Now, therefore, when Mark wrote the gospel for Romans, he presented Jesus Christ as this humble servant of God, so that they would relate to it. And precisely because of that reason, Mark's gospel is much shorter, because it is obvious that nobody would be interested in what a servant said. They would be interested in what a servant did. That's why Mark decided not to include all the lengthy discourses of Jesus. Like, he did not include all the teachings that Jesus made. Not that he did not include any, but he pretty much skipped most of the lengthy discourses. He focused on what Jesus did, making the gospel much shorter than Matthew's gospel. And because he kept using that style of keeping it pithy and short, perhaps that explains why his account of the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the shortest of all the gospels. Luke, on the other hand, wrote his gospel to a Greek convert, Theophilus, and Greeks in general. Now, Greeks are interested in attaining perfection, human perfection. And therefore, when Luke presented the gospel to them, he presented Jesus Christ as the perfect man. And then when John wrote his gospel, he was writing it for the world, for the Gentile world, and pretty much everyone, to all-encompassing. And his claim is to present Jesus Christ as the Son of God, as deity. And that's why you can see it right from the first chapter, first verse. It's so different from the other gospels, because other gospels focused on the humanity of Jesus as a king, as a servant, and as a perfect man. But then John is focusing on his deity. And John explicitly states in his gospel that the purpose for which he has written that gospel account is so that people may believe that Jesus Christ is deity, that he is God incarnate. Now, that is the reason why we have differences in the gospel accounts. That is why when the gospel writers were writing about the same incident, each one presented some gospel writers included details that other writers did not include. So that has to do with their purpose and the audience to which they were writing. Not because there have been embellishments, saying that the only explanation for some gospels having more details than the others is that they have been written later and embellished is being a bit biased, or is being a bit uninformed when it comes to the reasons why multiple gospel accounts have been written. Now, they say, okay, maybe, all right, maybe the Gospel of Matthew has been written first. So maybe the reason why some have more details than others are because, like you said, different purposes, different audiences. But that still leaves us with a question. Why are there contradictions? Some may have more details than others, but you shouldn't be having contradictions if they're all telling the truth. And that's true. I agree. But what these people say are contradictions are not really contradictions if only we read them a bit carefully and look at the context and see how people used to speak, how things used to be when those gospels were written. We would say that there are no real contradictions. The main contradiction that people point out to is the timing. So all four gospels say some women went to the tomb on the first day of the week to see the body of Jesus, and they did not find it there. But there seems to be some contradiction on when they went to the tomb. Let's look at that. Now, if you look at the Gospel of Matthew, he says towards the dawn. They went there towards the dawn. Mark says very early, when the sun had risen. And Luke says at early dawn. And then John says early while it was still dark. Now, that looks like a contradiction on the surface because Matthew and Luke says at early dawn or towards the dawn. Mark says when the sun had risen, and John says while it was still dark. And people say, hey, how can it be that it's both the sun had risen and it's still dark? It's easy. It could be when Mark says the sun had risen, it could be an expression to say that there is light already. And that is not an implausible explanation because that is normal. That is a normal way of describing things. Let's say, oh, it's already morning, or it's already, the sun's here. And what we mean is that, the light's already there. It's morning. And I've grown up hearing such phrases where I come from quite often. Now, it is understandable. And if Mark meant that by saying the sun had risen, if Mark meant to say that there is already light coming up, that would be perfectly fine because Matthew and Luke says at early dawn, towards the dawn, it is just about to be dawn time. And Mark says there is light, and that makes sense because that's the beginning of dawn. You slowly start to see the light coming up, although you can't see the sun directly. And then John says, while it was still dark, which would also be accurate, relatively speaking, because at early dawn, you have light, a bit of light. The sun's not clearly up above the horizon, but there is some light. But it's also dark, relatively speaking. It's not completely bright, as it would be in the morning after the sun is up at the horizon. So this, as you can see, this can be easily explained. It could be a matter of the way they expressed the thing, but they kept making the point that they all went early, quite early, when it was still early dawn, early dawn time. People who think this is a contradiction has to ask themselves, is it because this cannot be reconciled, all these four accounts cannot be reconciled, or is it because we want to find something so that we can go, aha, and reject it? That's for you to think. But there's one more. They would say, well, there are more differences. There are lots of differences. I've seen that in the video. They say, well, one account says there was one angel, the other account says there were two angels. One account says the woman did not tell anyone, the other account said the woman went and told the disciples. Which one is true? But those appear to be real contradictions. But again, if only we put the gospel accounts together, all the four gospel accounts together, we can see that they are perfectly harmonizable, if that's a word. We can perfectly harmonize them. They're not irreconcilable or unharmonizable. Now, I've done that for you. I've put color coding. I put the words taken from the Gospel of Matthew in blue, words taken from Mark in green, words taken from Luke in orange, and words taken from the Gospel of John in purple. Here we go. And I'm putting all the Gospels together and see how smoothly it flows without any contradiction. Now, you would also see occasionally some black words in black, and those are mine. I've used those words as connectors, fillers to connect the different sentences. So here we go. Now, after the Sabbath, very early, it was still dark, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, when the sun had just risen, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Salome, Joanna, and other women went to see the tomb, taking the spices they had prepared. And they were saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? And behold, while they were on their way, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. And for fear of him, the guards trembled and became like dead men. The women approached the tomb, and looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. But when they went in, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. Mary Magdalene ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. While they, the rest of the women, were perplexed about this, behold, two men stood by them in dazzling apparel. And as they were frightened and bowed their faces to the ground, the men said to them, why do you seek the living among the dead? The young man sitting on the right side said to them, do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him. Now, before I go ahead, I want to say a couple of things. Common objections would say, Matthew says there was one angel who came and rolled the stone, but then when the woman came, they saw two angels inside the tomb. And my question is, what's the problem? Matthew simply says one angel rolled the stone away. That doesn't mean there were no other angels there, isn't it? If Matthew said there was only one angel, that would be a problem. That would be a contradiction. Matthew simply says one angel rolled the stone and sat on it. By the time the woman came, that angel and the other angel obviously were inside the tomb. And the second objection, it's not something that is irreconcilable. Now, the second objection is that they'd say there were two men stood by them. So the two men in dazzling apparel, which means obviously they were angels. It's normal in the Bible to talk about angels as though appearing as men. The objection is they say, why does it say that a man sitting on the right side said to them that it was two angels, and later on we see that they said, again, I don't see why this is a contradiction, because when the woman came, there were two angels standing on either side of the place where they laid Jesus' body. But then perhaps when they began to speak, the angel sat, or one of the angels sat where they laid the Jesus' body, and he started speaking to them. Perhaps the sitting and standing, that is not a contradiction, and it can be easily explained. Now remember, gospel writers did not include every single detail. They had their own styles and they included details they felt were necessary and enough. So one of them spoke and said, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him." And then both together perhaps said, "Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and on the third day rise. Then go quickly and tell his disciples and Peter that he has risen from the dead. And behold, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him. See, I have told you." And they remembered his words. So as the angels said this, the women started to remember the words that Jesus spoke to them, that he'd already told them that he would be crucified and that he would rise on the third day. So they departed quickly. Mark adds, they went out and fled, which is the same as they departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy, and ran to tell his disciples. But trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So that's where Mark ends his account. And then we see the continuation in Matthew. And behold, by the way, which was written before Mark, and behold, Jesus met them and said, "Greetings." And they came up and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me." While they were going, behold, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, "Tell people, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So they took the money and did as they were directed. And this story has been spread among the Jews to this day. Now the woman, the woman, told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest, 11 apostles. That was, but these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them, the apostles and the disciples. They did not believe the words of these women. Now remember, Magdalene already told, and then these women came, and they said they did not believe. But Peter rose and went out with the other disciple, and they were going towards the tomb. Both of them were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. And stooping to look in, he saw the linen clothes lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen clothes by themselves and went into the tomb. He saw the linen clothes lying there, and the face cloth which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen clothes, but folded up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture, that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to their homes, marveling at what had happened. But Mary, this is Mary Magdalene, stood weeping outside the tomb. Now remember, when we harmonized it together, we saw that Mary Magdalene ran right away. She was in a rush. She went in, she didn't see the body, and then she right away ran and told Peter. So the rest of the women saw Jesus when they were trembling and astonished, and they decided not to tell anyone. Jesus appeared to them and said, "Don't be afraid, go and tell my disciples." But Mary Magdalene was not there. She missed that. So she hasn't seen Jesus. She only saw the empty tomb. So after Peter and James left, she just stood there outside weeping. And as she wept, she stooped to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white, just as the others have seen, sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one at the head and one at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." Having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing. But she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord," and that he had said these things to her. Now, this is a perfectly flowing story, a smoothly flowing narrative, as you have seen, without any contradictions. These gospel accounts can be harmonized so easily, so perfectly. And here's the thing. The fact that these gospel accounts can be harmonized, and yet the writers did not make any effort to harmonize them, shows their authenticity, shows that there hasn't been any consolidated effort to make up a single story and to perfectly align it with each other. They have written in their own styles, in their own ways, and they made no attempt to harmonize them, which is a big commendation in itself to their authenticity. Now, but if some people might still raise questions about why did Mary Magdalene did not recognize him, and why was she so surprised because other women already have seen and they went and told. Now, remember, these people, these disciples, did not really understand what Jesus had told them, although he mentioned that he would die and rise again. They did not grasp it, and they are still in unbelief. And that's why when the woman went and told the apostles, the people on whom the church was built, they did not believe him. They thought it's an idle tale. But Peter wanted to check. He went and checked, and others did not. They were still wondering what all of this is. Peter and James went and checked. James says he believed, but Peter went home marveling at what he had seen, the empty tomb and the lying clothes. He still did not confidently believe. And those women, when they saw Jesus, while they were afraid and decided not to tell anyone when Jesus appeared to them, they believed him and they worshipped him, and then they went and said. So we see a big unbelief going here. And also try to put yourself in their shoes. The amount of astonishment and shock they would have been in that someone would actually come back from the dead, and that person who came back from the dead is talking to them. Imagine what an astonishing and even traumatizing experience that would be for a lot of people. And that could explain why Mary is still weeping. She has heard the report of the women saying, "Hey, the body is not there. We saw Jesus." But probably Mary did not believe, or find it hard to believe their account. She only can see that the body is not there, and she's scared and worried and sad that someone took the body. She clearly thinks that someone took the body. She did not believe that Jesus rose. And when Jesus himself appeared, why did she not recognize him right away? Perhaps because, because it's unbelievable, so she wasn't really expecting to see him there. That's why she did not realize. That's one option. The other thing is that she's already sad and traumatized. But it could also be because although the resurrection body is in appearance similar to the previous body of Jesus Christ, perhaps there is a difference or this person is so broken, she did not immediately realize. But notice, whatever problem Magdalene or other disciples had, you would see if you keep reading, that some other people saw, and they also did not immediately recognize. That was only temporary. They could clearly see right away after he speaks a couple of words or so, they would realize, hey, this is Jesus. Perhaps they come out of that shock and they begin to accept the reality that they are seeing. And this in no way is something that cannot be explained or something that's contradictory with everything else we say. Now, so I finally want to say it's interesting how how atheists want to argue that these gospel accounts are probably legends. You have the 4 gospel accounts here, perfectly harmonized, without contradictions, and the minor things that appear to be contradictions can be easily explained by putting them in context. Plus, these gospel accounts and the writings of Apostle Paul, they all were written down within 20 to 40 years from the time the events actually took place. Now, that is a very, very small amount of small gap for any legends to have been built up and any legendary tendencies to have erased or corrupted the actual story so much so that we can't believe. I'll read you a small quote from a noted historian. So this is a scholar who has been studying these manuscripts says this. The writings of Greek historian Herodotus enables us to test the rate at which a legend accumulates. The tests show that even the span of 2 generations is too short to allow legendary tendencies to wipe out the hardcore of historical fact. We have that there. And it should be noted that there are mythological and legendary accounts of the Gospels, and they appear exactly when they should appear, more than 2 generations after the original writings and the original events. The Gospel of Thomas and other apocryphal Gospels written in the 2nd and 3rd century make that point, that they prove that point. They did appear, legends did appear, but they appear 2 generations later, not within 40 to 50 years. That is too small a time span for legends to accumulate. Now, the former atheist and famous myth writer of Narnia, the Narnia series, said this, C.S. Lewis. This is what he said. All I am in private life is a literary critic and historian. That's my job. And I am prepared to say, on that basis, if anyone thinks the Gospels are either legends or novels, then that person is simply showing his incompetence as a literary critic. I read a great many novels, and I know a fair amount about the legends that grew up among early people. And I know perfectly well the Gospels are not that kind of stuff. There you have it. I would also want to add, before I quote from Shonen White, with what I've said now, with the quotes from C.S. Lewis and other scholars, again, this is my question. What is it that makes people reject the Gospels? What is it that makes them try so hard to explain them away as legends or unreliable sources? We say that they are written so close to the events that they can't be legends, but people still want to say they're legends. People want to accuse them of being contradictory and embellished accounts, while evidence shows that they are not embellished, and whatever appears to be contradictory can easily be explained and harmonized. And my friend, if you're watching this as a skeptic, as an atheist, and if you're still unwilling to accept the evidence that is before your eyes, ask yourself why. I'll close this video with a couple of more observations. A noted authority on Roman society and law, A.N. Sherman White, wrote this. So it is astonishing that while Greco-Roman historians have been growing in confidence, the 20th century study of the gospel narratives, starting from no less promising material, have taken so gloomy a turn in the development of form criticism that the historical Christ is unknowable and the history of his mission cannot be written. This seems very curious. And it is indeed curious if you don't understand what he's saying. He's saying that the scholars who have been studying Greco-Roman history have been growing in confidence with the manuscripts they've been uncovering. They're very certain, they're pretty sure that what we have today is an actual a copy or an actual sayings of what people actually said. The copies that we have today are reliable. Let me put it that way. They are reliable. And they are growing in confidence of the reliability of the information we have. But at the same time, skeptics have been growing in their skepticism, and they keep saying, the New Testament Gospels, they're not really reliable. We can't really be sure. They probably are legends. And the same person, Sherwin White, went on to say that the mythological view is unbelievable. And he's right. And I'll show you in a moment why. If you look at this chart on the screen, it shows you the number of manuscripts that are available for different ancient writings. And look at the staggering difference. The blue bar shows the time gap in years between the actual, the original writing and the earliest copy of that manuscript that we have today. And the orange bar shows the number of manuscripts, either part fragments or full manuscripts that we have. The gap is 25 years for New Testament materials. And the number of copies we have is 5,750. This number could be slightly different now because of how people group fragments into manuscripts, but it's definitely about 5,000. And by the way, this is just the Greek copies. We have more copies in other languages. Now compare that with the copies we have for Plato, the works of Plato, or writings of Plato. 7 manuscript copies, and a 1,200-year gap between the actual writing and the earliest copy we have. Homer, 643 copies, and a 500-year gap between the actual writing and the earliest copy we have. The reason why I'm showing this graph to you is to show you that if we cannot trust the New Testament writings, if scholars want to say that, we cannot, the New Testament writings have been somehow changed and became legends, and therefore we cannot know the truth that they are trying to say, then there is no way we can trust any of the books of antiquity. Any. None comes even close. But we don't question the existence of Alexander or his military expeditions. We don't question that Plato actually said what we think he said. These things are taken as though they are true, and that's what Sherwin White was saying, that we have been growing in confidence that these things are actually true. But then we're showing our bias by saying the New Testament accounts are somehow not reliable. What does this show? Does this show an objective lack of evidence? Or does this show that the skeptics themselves are biased? I'll leave that to you to conclude. I'll leave that to you to decide. And before I finish this, just one final thing. Simon Greenleaf, a professor of law at Harvard University, he died in 1853. He was one of the greatest legal minds in American history. He wrote a book on how to treat law, how to treat evidence, and how to check evidence and witnesses, which is used even to this day to train lawyers. When he was challenged to apply the same standards to the Gospels, he did, and he wrote a book called The Testimony of Evangelists. And he concluded that the New Testament documents and witnesses, if they were to be tested in a court of law, they would prove to be reliable. And then this is what he said to the readers, to the skeptics. He said, all that Christianity asks of men on this subject is that they would be consistent with themselves, that they would treat its evidences as they treat the evidence of other things, and that they would try and judge its actors and witnesses as they deal with their fellow men. When testifying to human affairs and actions in human tribunals, let the witnesses be compared with themselves, with each other, and with surrounding facts and circumstances, and let their testimony be sifted, as if it were given in a court of justice. On the side of the adverse party, the witness being subjected to rigorous cross-examination. The result, it is confidently believed, will be an undoubting conviction of their integrity, ability, and truth. And that is my request to you, my friends, today. Please be unbiased when you come to the New Testament documents. Test them and see whether they're reliable or not. I hope I've provided you enough reasons to trust the authenticity and reliability of New Testament Gospels. But if you still want to reject, ask yourself, is it because you've already made up your mind to reject them? Or is it because this is not a compelling evidence for you?